Alright, deriving the quadratic formula by completing the square is a really important standard for taking the EOC. So we must know how to do this. The first step here I have written down are 5 steps for completing the square, but I'm also going to write down the steps as everything that I do for the problem. The first thing, in the quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, a must be 1. Now right now we actually have an a there, and I need that to be 1x squared, not ax squared. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide everything by a. So I'm going to take this equation, I'm going to divide everything by a. So my first step here, I have x squared, because a divided by a would just leave 1, b over a, so I have b over a, that's my x term now, and my last term will be c over a. Now that a is 1, in this sense, at 1x squared, my next step is to take c to the other side. So this c term here, my constant, has to be on the other side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract c over a to both sides. So this is our first step. Here is our second step. So all I did was divide everything by a, and then I subtracted my constant to the other side. In this case, it was just c over a. That was my constant in this formula. My next step for completing the square, if you see on number 3, it says make a perfect squared trinomial. So we're going to make our perfect squared trinomial by taking our middle, I forgot my x on here. Sorry about that, guys. So I'm going to take my middle term and find what number will complete the square. So right now we're not dealing with numbers. It's a little bit harder when we actually work with this. But what we're doing, we're going to still take our middle term. And we always take our middle term and divide it by 2. Now whenever we have divided by 2, we have a fraction and a fraction. So instead of dividing by 2, I'm just going to multiply it by 1/2. Think about if I had 6, and I multiplied 6 by 1/2. 6 times 1/2 is 3. So multiplying something by 1/2 and dividing by 2 is the same exact process. So first thing I'm going to do is divide it in half. So this will give me b over 2a. Alright, so that's dividing in half. When I take my middle term and divide it in half, the next step I do is I square it. If you need to refresh on completing the square, we take it in half and then we square it. So this will give us b squared, 2 squared, over a squared. So I have b squared over 4a squared. I squared each part in that fraction. Now, when I complete the square, this is the number I'm adding, b squared over 4a squared. I've got to keep it balanced. So I'm also going to add b squared over 4a squared. So this step in pink, I completed the square. All right. Kind of tricky when there's not actually numbers in there, but please stick with me. Now my next step, I've got to factor it. So I want to rewrite, so this was our step 3. I want to rewrite x squared plus b over ax plus b squared over 4a squared. And I'm going to combine these in a little bit. Negative c over a plus b squared 4a over 4a squared. I want to rewrite this as a perfect square binomial. So I need to figure out what is going to be squared in my perfect square binomial. Well, think back when we actually completed the square, there was kind of a shortcut to find what number is going to be in the perfect square binomial. When we took our middle term and divided it in half, this number before we squared it was the number on the inside parts. So b over 2a is going to be positive b over 2a, the perfect square binomial. All right, let's clean up the right side of the equation now. I've got two fractions added together. However, I can't actually add these fractions together. I have to be able to have a common denominator to add the squares together. So the next step on this side, we're going to find a common denominator and add. So I need to make this one full term. So my common denominator, if this is a and this is 4a squared, this is my common denominator. I need to make this term also 4a squared in order to make these terms in order to add the fractions. So this one's already 4a squared. How could I make this a be 4a squared? Well, if I multiply a times 4a, 4a times a is 4a squared. But don't forget, we are fair in math, so if I have to multiply the bottom of this equation to get this to be 4a squared, I also have to multiply the top of the equation by 4a. So let's write down this next step. On top, I have negative c times 4a, negative 4ac. On bottom, I have 4a squared. And I'm going to add that to my term that's been there, b squared over 4a squared. Now that we have a common denominator, we can add these together. Notice when we add them together though, negative 4ac and b squared are not like terms. I'm going to write them right here. So I have b squared minus 4ac. Now notice I put the b squared first. I put the positive one first and then minus 4ac. All over, same denominator, 4a squared. So now I have made the right side one term by finding a common denominator and adding those two fractions. I still have on this side x plus b over 2a quantity squared from my perfect square binomial. All right, that was our factoring part, and we simplified this a little bit too. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually solve for x. That's our step number 5. Now notice x is right here. We have the quantity squared. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I'm going to square root both sides of the equation. Take a square root here and a square root here. Okay. This square root, the purpose we did it was to get rid of that squared. So on the left side of the equation, I'm just left with a plus b over 2a equals. Now, we're going to simplify this. The first thing we need to keep in mind is when we take the square roots, we have plus or minus here. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to separate that radical on the numerator and the denominator. So I have b squared minus 4ac over square roots of 4a squared. Now, we've done a couple problems like this when we separated it, and our denominator always came out even. If you notice in our denominator right now, the square root of 4 is 2. The square root of a squared is a. So I'm going to simplify that. Top does not simplify, do not have perfect squares in there. The bottom, however, becomes 2a. All right, still solving for x. So my next step, I'm going to subtract b over 2a to both sides. So we are subtracting b over 2a. So this becomes x equals negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now remember, when we had the common denominator, we can rewrite this as one fraction. So now I have x squared equals, I can combine these two, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of it over the common denominator of 2a. Does this look familiar? This is our quadratic formula. If you need some more help with this, go back through the video to remember each step we did in order to complete the square to get the quadratic formula.